The medieval sky was never truly calm. Over small villages tucked against the forests or stone-gray towns, black clouds would gather without warning, pouring sheets of cold rain upon the earth. With houses roofed in thatch or crude planks, rain was not a minor inconvenience but a real threat. For medieval people, rain meant sickness, rotting crops, and clothes soaked through, clinging to the skin during the biting winds of winter. A simple chill, a lingering fever, these could take a life. Picture an autumn morning in northern France in the 13th century. The road has turned to mud, cartwheels sink, and a peasant's worn leather shoes tear in the mire. Bent beneath a bundle of firewood, his wool cloak grows heavy with water, streams running like icy knives down his back. There is nothing to protect him but sheer endurance and whispered prayers, for damp clothes often led to nights of coughing in a dark hut, and too often to death. Rain was not only a physical enemy but a psychological weight. In cities, merchants watched anxiously as their goods risked ruin. Precious manuscripts warped, imported silks mildewed, spices spoiled. One heavy storm could mean financial disaster. On the battlefield, soldiers trudged across sodden fields, armor rusted, bowstrings sagged, and the cold sapped strength before the enemy even struck. No wonder men and women searched desperately for ways to shield themselves. They first turned to thick wool or animal hides, hoping to block the water. But hides rotted quickly when damp, and wool, though warm, absorbed weight until it dragged on the shoulders like stone. Out of this world of frustration came a small but ingenious discovery: beeswax, melted and rubbed into fabric or leather, turning a simple cloak into a barrier against the storm. What is striking is that this discovery did not arise from grand castles or wealthy abbeys, but from the practical ingenuity of common folk. They observed the bees, saw the resilience of the hive, and realized nature had already crafted the perfect waterproof seal. With beeswax, they fashioned cloaks that kept bodies dry and spirits unbroken through endless downpours. These waxed cloaks became more than garments. They were companions of farmers in the fields, traders on treacherous roads, and soldiers marching beneath gray skies. In the endless patter of rain, they stood as the fragile line between health and sickness, between survival and despair. Looking back, we see that these cloaks were proof of human resilience. Medieval men and women, however poor or constrained, never stopped searching for ways to master their environment. And the story of the beeswax cloak begins here, with rain, that relentless enemy, and the determination to fight it. Before beeswax became the secret weapon against storms, medieval people experimented with every material within their reach. The methods were crude, sometimes desperate, but they reveal an enduring creativity when survival depended on staying dry. Wool was the most common choice. Sheep thrived across Europe, and wool's natural warmth was its greatest strength. Even wet, it insulated the body. A thick woolen cloak kept the chill at bay, but it could not resist water. Once soaked, it grew unbearably heavy and reeked of lanolin. Still, peasants clung to it, sometimes smearing the surface with animal fat or oil to repel rain. But fat washed away quickly under long storms, leaving them drenched once more. Animal hides were another solution. Cloaks made from deer, cow, or sheepskin served both peasants and hunters. At first, the thick leather seemed to resist moisture, but soon it grew heavy, stiff, and foul-smelling. Damp leather cracked or rotted, and to dry it by the fire often made it stiff as wood. In coastal lands, some turned to fish oil or seal fat, rubbing it onto fabric or hide. The Vikings perfected this trick for sea voyages. Yet the stench was unbearable. The wearer remained drier, but their presence announced itself long before they arrived. Worse, oil-soaked garments could ignite near open flames, an invisible danger no less feared than the rain. The poorest villagers resorted to straw. They stuffed it between layers of cloth or tied bundles across their shoulders. For a time it repelled water, but soon it sagged, decayed, and reeked of rot. Imagine the rustle of straw beneath a downpour, the hunched figures pressing forward, more burden than protection. Some even tried tree resins. Sticky pine pitch spread across cloth created a crude waterproof skin, but resin cracked in the cold, turned brittle, and glued itself unpleasantly to the wearer. It served well for bags or covers, but never as a true cloak. All these efforts, wool, hide, oil, straw, resin, were human promises to resist the storm. Yet each promise broke in time. Clothes became heavy, foul, fragile. The rain always won. It was from this frustration that people searched for something better. And in the glimmering cells of a honeycomb, they found it. Beeswax. Pure, fragrant, and astonishingly effective. Amidst crude hides and foul-smelling oils, few could have imagined that the key to dryness lay hidden in the humble hive. But medieval people were masters of observation. They saw how the bees built combs of golden wax, strong enough to endure storms, winters, and time itself. From this insight, they drew a revelation. Beeswax could shield not only the hive, but man himself. Beeswax was already precious. It lit churches in the form of pure candles, its clean flame seen as holy light, unsullied by smoke. For this reason, it was costly, guarded, traded like treasure. Yet curious craftsmen and peasants learned to melt it, rub it into fabric or leather, and discovered that rain slid away as if denied entry. The marvel lay in the nature of beeswax itself. Solid at rest, yet melting easily, it seeped into the smallest gaps of woven cloth, sealing fibers from within. Once cooled, it hardened again, forming a supple but firm barrier. Water, that patient invader, could no longer find a way through. Beyond dryness, beeswax added strength. It stiffened cloth, made it tear-resistant, and spared wearers the stench of rot. Unlike animal oils, it carried a faint sweetness, the memory of honey and meadows, making a waxed cloak not only useful, but oddly comforting. The spread of this practice may have begun in monasteries, where beekeeping was common, or among merchants traveling long roads. Wherever it began, it soon found its way to fields, markets, and marches. Farmers, traders, and soldiers alike learned to trust these cloaks in storms that once brought misery. There was, too, a spiritual shade to the practice. Bees were revered as symbols of purity and divine order, their hives seen as mirrors of the heavenly community. To wear a cloak anointed with their wax was, in some eyes, to wear a blessing, nature's shield, consecrated by creation itself. Thus, beeswax cloaks became more than protection. They were symbols of human ingenuity and faith. From careful eyes watching bees in the wild, medieval people had drawn a miracle from nature. What we might call simple technology, they knew as both survival and grace. To imagine the medieval art of waterproofing, one must step into a workshop lit by flickering tallow lamps, the air thick with the scent of honey and smoke. On the table rests a pot of golden beeswax, slowly melting over a low fire, its surface shimmering like liquid sunlight. Around it lie rolls of rough wool, sheets of leather, and tools blackened with years of use. The process was simple in principle, but in practice demanded patience, skill, and no small measure of caution. The first step was preparation. Cloth had to be clean, dry, and tightly woven. Loose fibers meant gaps for water to creep through, so the best wool or linen was chosen. Leather, too, required careful scraping and smoothing, for cracks or scars could break the seal. Then came the beeswax itself, collected from hives, sometimes purchased at a high price, sometimes traded from monastic apiaries. It was melted slowly, never hurried, for too much heat could scorch the wax and ruin its purity. When the wax had turned to liquid, the craftsmen used brushes, rags, or even bare hands to rub it into the fabric. The trick was thoroughness. Every thread had to be saturated. In some cases, cloth was dipped directly into vats of wax, then lifted out steaming and dripping to be hung before the fire. Leather, on the other hand, was massaged with wax by hand, the warmth of palms working it deep into the grain. After coating came the curing. Cloaks were hung by the hearth or in the sun, where the wax would seep further into the fibers, hardening as it cooled. Some artisans repeated the process several times, layering wax until the surface gleamed faintly when light struck it. The result was not just waterproof, but resilient, a cloak ready to face weeks of storm. Yet the process did not end there. Waxed garments required care. With use, cracks could form, or the coating might wear thin on the shoulders and hems. Owners learned to reapply wax, reheating and massaging it back into place, keeping the garment alive season after season. A well-kept waxed cloak could last years, an heirloom passed from father to son, mother to daughter. The sensation of wearing such a cloak was unforgettable. It was heavier than ordinary cloth, but not unbearably so. When rain fell, droplets slid down its surface like beads of glass, leaving the wearer dry beneath. A faint fragrance lingered, a blend of wool, smoke, and honey that marked its uniqueness. To many, it was as much a comfort as a shield, a reminder that nature's fury could be met with human craft. In markets and fairs, such cloaks became prized. Travelers admired their sheen, soldiers trusted their durability, and merchants knew they could protect not just the body, but the goods they carried. To own one was to walk with confidence, even as skies darkened and winds rose. And though they demanded effort to produce and maintain, their value lay precisely in that effort. A waxed cloak was not a disposable trifle, but a companion, forged by hand and care. Thus, the process of waxing fabric and leather was more than a technical craft. It was a ritual of resilience. Each stroke of wax into cloth, each hour of curing, spoke of human persistence against the storm. And in every finished cloak, gleaming faintly like amber in the lamplight, there lived both the labor of the craftsman and the quiet promise of survival. The waxed cloak was not merely a garment, it was a mark of circumstance, opportunity, and sometimes even privilege. Not all in medieval society could afford the golden sheen of beeswax protection, and so the cloak became a subtle indicator of class, necessity, and occupation. To trace who wore it is to glimpse the hierarchy of the Middle Ages through the lens of reign. Among peasants, the waxed cloak was a rarity. Beeswax was costly, valued more for candles on holy altars than for the backs of field workers. Most villagers labored under woolen mantles, soaked through by storms. Yet in certain regions, where local hives were plentiful and community knowledge thrived, a few peasants managed to craft waxed cloaks of their own. For them, it was less a luxury than a shield against misery, a way to endure the endless toil in fields that turned to marsh under steady rains. To see a farmer with such a cloak was to know he was resourceful, or fortunate enough to barter with a beekeeper. For merchants and travelers, however, waxed cloaks were essential. These men and women lived on the road, their fortunes tied to the safety of their wares. Bolts of cloth, sacks of spices, fragile manuscripts, all could be ruined by a single night of downpour. A waxed cloak meant not only personal comfort, but protection for goods wrapped and hidden beneath. Imagine a trader crossing the Alps, rain slashing down, his mule laden with salt and wine. Without beeswax, his cargo would arrive spoiled. With it, he could reach the market intact, his profits secured. Soldiers and guards also valued waxed cloaks. A night watchman pacing the battlements in winter rain, or a soldier marching with a host on campaign, knew the misery of wet clothes. Rust on armor, rot in leather straps, sickness from dampness. These were enemies as deadly as the sword. A waxed cloak became part of their kit, often draped over armor, glistening like oil in torchlight. Some chronicles even speak of knights on crusade wearing waxed mantles, their banners sagging with water while their bodies remained dry beneath a shield of beeswax. Clerics and pilgrims, too, embraced the waxed cloak. The road to holy sites was long, and rain was a constant trial. For monks who kept bees in monastery gardens, waxing cloaks was a natural extension of their craft. Pilgrims fortunate enough to obtain such cloaks wore them with gratitude, seeing in the beeswax not only protection, but a divine blessing. After all, the wax had already served God in the form of candles. Now it served his servants on the road. At the highest levels, waxed cloaks could even be symbols of status. Nobles on hunts wore them to keep their fine garments safe. Wealthy townsmen commissioned cloaks with wax worked into finer cloth, lined with fur, practical, yet elegant. For them, a waxed cloak was not simply survival. It was a statement, proof that they could command both the bees of the field and the labor of craftsmen. Thus, across medieval Europe, the waxed cloak threaded its way through society. It was rare among peasants, common among merchants, trusted by soldiers, cherished by pilgrims, and polished into prestige by nobles. Always it carried the same promise, that beneath its sheen, the wearer would endure the storm. And in that promise lay a curious equality. Whether farmer or knight, monk or merchant, the rain fell on all. And all, if they could, sought the same golden shield woven from the labor of bees and men. The medieval road was no gentle path. It wound through forests prowled by wolves, across marshes that swallowed boots, and over mountains where snow turned trails into death traps. Rain, however, was the most constant and relentless adversary. Travelers knew that wetness was not just discomfort, it was danger. Damp food spoiled, wet boots bred sickness, sodden maps and letters blurred into useless ink stains. A waxed cloak was thus more than a garment. It was survival wrapped around the shoulders. Imagine the pilgrim trudging toward Santiago de Compostela, staff in hand, his pack slung across his back. Days of rain could turn the road into a river of mud, each step a slow sinking. Without protection, his woolen cloak would drink in the storm until it weighed him down like a stone. But with beeswax worked into the fabric, water slid away in rivulets, dripping off like tears on stone. Beneath, his food, his letters of passage, his very hope of reaching the shrine remained dry. For countless wanderers of faith, a waxed cloak was the silent companion that guarded their journey. Merchants and envoys relied upon them even more. To carry goods across leagues of sodden land without ruin was the test of fortune itself. Leather pouches swelled with moisture, wooden chests warped, parchment writs blurred. But a man under a waxed cloak had an advantage. Beneath its oily shimmer, He could wrap his wares in further layers, ensuring that salt, sugar, or silks survived the miles. Trade, after all, was the lifeblood of towns and kingdoms. Without protection against the weather, a storm could undo months of planning. And so the waxed cloak became a merchant's shield, not of steel, but of bees and cloth. But on the fields of war, the cloak gained another reputation entirely. Picture the army camp. Thousands of men huddled in the open, their fires sputtering as rain soaked tents and hay. Armor rusted overnight, shields grew heavy, and sickness spread like wildfire. Yet those with waxed cloaks endured better. Soldiers wore them over mail, knights draped them across their shoulders as they rode, scouts pulled them tightly while watching the enemy from the shadows of trees. When every ounce of strength mattered, the difference between a soaked, shivering man and one kept dry could decide who survived the campaign. Some chronicles even whisper of commanders who ordered waxed cloaks for their men before long campaigns. During the Crusades, waxed mantles appeared among knights of both East and West, their sheen catching torchlight like oil-slick shadows. In rain-drenched Europe, wars fought in autumn or spring saw whole companies marching beneath such cloaks, their banners dripping, but their bodies protected. Rain could ruin a siege, drown morale, and turn courage into fever. Waxed cloaks helped tip the balance. Travelers, soldiers, and spies alike prized them for secrecy as well. The wax lent a strange glisten under moonlight, darkening the cloak and rendering the wearer less visible in shadows. A scout cloaked in beeswax could slip through rain-drenched woods almost unseen, his body muffled beneath a slick, soundless garment. In an age when intelligence often meant life or death, a cloak could be a spy's greatest ally. And yet the waxed cloak was not invincible. Too much rain, days unending, and the wax would weaken, wash away, and the garment would sag beneath the storm. Soldiers cursed it, travelers despaired. Rewaxing was constant work. No cloak lasted forever. Still, when the storm clouds gathered, men and women across medieval Europe clutched at their waxed mantles, for even imperfect shelter was better than none. In travel and in war, the waxed cloak was a soldier's armor against the sky, a merchant's guardian of goods, a pilgrim's companion on holy paths. It was a quiet piece of technology, born of bees and patience, that changed the way people endured the road. And in a world where a storm could decide the fate of a battle or the survival of a soul, the waxed cloak was no mere clothing. It was strategy. Clothing in the Middle Ages was never just clothing. Every thread, color, and texture carried meaning, broadcasting the wearer's place in society, their fortune, or even their piety. The waxed cloak was no different. It might have been born from practicality, but in time it grew into a symbol of resilience, ingenuity, and even divine protection. Among peasants, to own a waxed cloak was to stand apart. Most villagers trudged through rain in sodden wool, their backs bent under the storm. But the one who wore a waxed cloak seemed shielded, almost blessed. Neighbors might whisper of his good fortune, or his cleverness in mastering a craft that transformed bees' labor into human defense. The waxed cloak, therefore, symbolized resourcefulness, the ability to carve a pocket of safety in a world stacked against survival. For merchants, its symbolism ran deeper. A waxed cloak marked a traveler of means, someone who could afford protection against the uncertainties of the road. It became a silent declaration of professionalism, a badge of seriousness. To step into a market square glistening with waxed mantle meant one had weathered the storms, both literal and figurative. The cloak, in such cases, represented reliability, proof that this man's wares had survived the long journey unspoiled. In the hands of soldiers, the waxed cloak carried martial symbolism. Draped over armor, it suggested readiness, an unyielding spirit that even the skies could not dampen. On the march, men saw their cloaked captain as a figure almost untouchable by the storm, and it stirred morale. The sheen of wax in torchlight became associated with endurance, with the notion that no matter how long the siege or how brutal the campaign, the army would hold. The cloak here became a symbol of perseverance, a quiet promise of survival against both enemy and weather. Clerics and pilgrims, however, imbued the waxed cloak with spiritual meaning. Beeswax itself was sacred, drawn from hives that symbolized the ordered perfection of God's creation. Candles of beeswax illuminated altars. To carry its protection on one's cloak was to carry the echo of the divine. Pilgrims spoke of waxed cloaks as shields granted by providence, a sign that God's creatures, the bees, had lent their labor to human faith. Monks saw in the wax a metaphor. Just as wax sealed fabric against rain, so too did God's grace shield the soul against sin. In noble courts, symbolism turned toward prestige. To be wrapped in a waxed cloak lined with fur was to declare mastery over nature and wealth alike. Nobles wore them not just to keep dry on hunts, but as an emblem of dominion over bees, craftsmen, and the elements themselves. The waxed cloak, in this sense, became a subtle banner of status, a reminder that even the storm could not humble the powerful. Yet the symbolism of the waxed cloak was not always positive. Some saw it as a mark of pride or unnecessary luxury. Chronicles mention whispers of villagers sneering at lords who flaunted gleaming cloaks while their tenants shivered in rags. In this way, the cloak could also represent division, a physical manifestation of the gap between those who could command protection and those who endured exposure. Still, across classes and contexts, the waxed cloak carried one universal symbolism: defiance. It was the human attempt to say to the storm, "You will not break me." In the Middle Ages, where nature was vast and merciless, that defiance mattered. The waxed cloak became more than fabric. It became a metaphor for humanity's endless struggle against the forces it could not control. To see a man in a waxed cloak trudging through rain was to see a story in motion. A farmer asserting dignity, a merchant protecting livelihood, a knight promising endurance, a pilgrim wrapped in faith. The cloak was cloth and wax, yes, but it was also identity, hope, and resistance woven together beneath a storm-darkened sky. In a world where storms seemed like the wrath of God and bees were seen as heaven's tiny laborers, it was inevitable that the waxed cloak would creep into the tales and folklore of medieval Europe. People told stories not only to explain the unknown, but also to give meaning to the ordinary objects that shaped their lives. And so, the waxed cloak, half invention, half miracle, became the subject of whispered legends. In one village, they told of a shepherd who wandered the hills with nothing but a cloak his father had soaked in beeswax. When a sudden storm swept across the mountains, lightning struck the earth all around him, yet not a drop of rain touched his skin. The villagers said his cloak had been blessed by the Virgin herself, the bees carrying divine favor from hive to hive. From then on, shepherds in that valley wore waxed mantles not just for dryness, but for protection against evil spirits that lurked in the rain. Merchants told their own stories, often by firelight in taverns along trade routes. One tale spoke of a traveling cloth seller who was ambushed on a stormy night by thieves. They searched him for valuables, yet his cloak, slick with wax, repelled their grasp like water itself. Slipping from their hands, he fled into the darkness, and the thieves swore that the cloak was enchanted, woven from moonlight and honey. For generations, merchants repeated the tale, half warning, half charm, until the waxed cloak itself became a talisman of safety on the road. Among soldiers, stories were darker. Chroniclers mention an account from the 100 Years' War of a knight who wore a waxed cloak so black and gleaming it looked like the feathers of a raven. He was said to ride into battle under rain clouds, arrows sliding off his garment as though the storm itself protected him. Some claimed he had bargained with witches for the bees' labor. Others believed he was cursed, for he was eventually struck down not by man or storm, but by a fever that no cloak could ward away. His tale became a warning. No garment, however enchanted, could protect against fate. In the monasteries, stories took on a gentler tone. Monks told of Saint Gobnate of Ireland, the patron saint of bees, who once draped her waxed mantle over a sick child. When the rain ceased and sunlight returned, the child recovered, and the cloak was said to smell sweet as honey. Pilgrims clung to such tales, believing that their waxed cloaks carried echoes of healing, the wax infused with both the labor of bees and the grace of God. In folklore, the waxed cloak also took on mystical roles. In certain Breton tales, it was said that if one wore a cloak freshly waxed during a storm and stood at the crossroads at midnight, the rain would part like a curtain, revealing spirits of the dead who walked the earth unseen. Farmers warned their children never to test the tale, for such knowledge came with curses. Yet the whisper of it lingered, giving the waxed cloak a shiver of mystery, even in everyday life. Not all tales were solemn. Some were simple stories of cleverness. In one German fable, a poor miller tricked a greedy tax collector by hiding coins within folds of his waxed cloak, the wax making the garment stiff enough to conceal the weight. When the collector demanded a bribe, the miller shook out his cloak, letting rain slide over it, saying, "The bees protect me, and so too does God." The collector, superstitious and fearful, let him go free. These legends, spun from rain-soaked nights and candlelit retellings, reveal how deeply woven the waxed cloak became in the medieval imagination. It was never just protection from storms. It was a bridge between the natural and the supernatural, a garment of cloth and wax that carried stories of survival, faith, and the uncanny. To wear one was to step into not just history, but myth. Every invention, no matter how clever, has its season. The waxed cloak, once cherished across muddy roads and battlefield camps, eventually began to fade from daily use. Its decline was not sudden, but slow and steady, as Europe shifted, adapted, and discovered new ways to fight the rain. By the late Middle Ages, trade routes had expanded, and cloth itself was evolving. Fullers, dyers, and weavers perfected their crafts, producing tighter, denser fabrics that resisted water better than the rough weaves of earlier centuries. Wealthier towns offered access to imported cloth from Flanders and Italy, textiles so finely woven that they naturally repelled much of the rain. Wax was still used, but increasingly less vital. Why spend precious beeswax on cloaks when the altar candles, considered vital for both worship and status, demanded more of it? The church, with its endless appetite for sacred candles, consumed vast reserves of beeswax, leaving little for common folk to pour into fabric. For soldiers, too, changes came swiftly. By the 15th century, heavy armor had shifted to plate, and campaigns relied more on tents, wagons, and supply trains than individual garments. Cloaks, waxed or not, mattered less when entire companies carried canvas shelters. In time, armies adopted oilcloths and treated leather, materials that outlasted beeswax in the ceaseless wet of war. The waxed cloak, once a soldier's silent ally, became old-fashioned, a relic of rougher days. Yet the cloak never fully vanished. Among peasants in remote regions, where innovation moved slowly, the waxed mantle endured. Farmers in wind-swept villages of the British Isles and shepherds in mountain valleys of the Alps still trusted in beeswax, passed down through generations of craft. These cloaks, glistening faintly in rain, became echoes of an older Europe, worn by men and women who resisted the march of time, with traditions as stubborn as the storm itself. The rediscovery came centuries later. By the 17th and 18th centuries, as exploration and seafaring expanded, the problem of waterproof clothing returned with urgency. Sailors needed garments that could withstand relentless sea spray and storms that dwarfed any countryside shower. In their experiments, they rediscovered the principle once practiced by medieval villagers: wax. Coating fabric with wax or oil produced waterproof gear, primitive by modern standards, but life-saving in the fury of the Atlantic. The mariner's slicker, born in this period, was in many ways the descendant of the medieval waxed cloak. The Industrial Revolution transformed this rediscovery into mass production. New chemicals, oils, and eventually rubber offered better solutions, but wax never disappeared entirely. Hunters, explorers, and country folk continued to wax their cloaks and jackets well into the 19th century. Indeed, even today, traditional waxed jackets remain prized for their durability, echoing an invention whose roots stretched back to the Middle Ages. In a curious twist, the waxed cloak also resurfaced in romantic imagination. Writers and painters of the 19th century, enamored with medieval nostalgia, depicted travelers and knights cloaked in waxed mantles glistening under stormy skies. To them, the cloak symbolized grit, romance, and the eternal human battle against nature's cruelty. It became a symbol not of technology, but of timelessness, proof that even in an age of steam and steel, humanity still admired the ingenuity of bees and cloth. Thus, the waxed cloak lived on, not as it once had, the everyday companion of merchants, pilgrims, and farmers, but as a memory, reborn whenever humanity needed to remember its old struggle against the rain. It declined, yes, but it was never forgotten. Every time wax is brushed into fabric today, every time a hunter in the highlands dons a waxed jacket, the ghost of the medieval cloak stirs again, glistening in the storm. Though centuries have passed since the Middle Ages, the waxed cloak lingers in memory, imagination, and tradition. It is no longer the daily shield against rain for farmers or the practical armor for soldiers, yet it survives as a symbol, an echo of humanity's timeless struggle against nature. In modern times, its legacy unfolds in curious, almost poetic ways. Step into a countryside market in northern England or Scotland today, and you may still see jackets and cloaks made with beeswaxed canvas, their surfaces gleaming faintly under drizzle. These garments are the descendants of medieval ingenuity, beloved for their durability and their timeless feel. Hunters, anglers, and wanderers of moors and fields treasure them, not because they lack newer fabrics, but because the waxed garment carries an aura of authenticity, as if its wearer has inherited an ancient secret whispered by generations. In literature and film, the waxed cloak remains a powerful image. Novelists conjure up travelers trudging through rain-soaked forests, their cloaks glistening like obsidian. Screenwriters dress knights, outlaws, and pilgrims in mantles that shed storm water as if enchanted. The waxed cloak in storytelling has become a shorthand for endurance, a visual cue that says, "Here is someone who braves the storm and presses forward." Even fantasy worlds borrow from its symbolism, clothing heroes in waxed mantles to hint at resilience rooted in history. Folklore, too, has not forgotten. In rural traditions, especially in regions where bees remain sacred, old tales of waxed cloaks are still told. They carry with them themes of protection, resourcefulness, and divine favor. Some folklorists note that the waxed cloak continues to appear in oral stories of the man who walks untouched in the rain, a character who embodies mystery and survival. Each retelling is a faint echo of those medieval nights when villagers gathered by firelight to share legends of cloaks that defied storms. Perhaps the most striking legacy lies in the way the waxed cloak reminds us of humanity's partnership with nature. In an age when technology often feels divorced from the earth, the waxed cloak stands as a reminder that once people looked to bees, to their tireless labor, their golden wax, to solve problems of survival. It tells us that even in the harshness of the Middle Ages, innovation was born not from machines, but from observation of the natural world. To wear such a cloak today is not merely practical, it is symbolic of a bond between man and bee, cloth and hive, survival and ingenuity. Even in urban culture, the image lingers. Fashion designers occasionally revive waxed fabrics, not for farmers or sailors, but for style. The sheen of wax on cloth suggests ruggedness, authenticity, and connection to a past when garments were made not to dazzle, but to endure. In this way, the waxed cloak lives again, striding through city streets just as it once strode through medieval markets. The waxed cloak's legacy, then, is not confined to museums or history books. It is alive in countryside traditions, in folklore, in the arts, and in the garments still waxed and re-waxed by hand today. It represents resilience against storms both literal and metaphorical. It whispers of pilgrims, merchants, and knights, and of bees buzzing in forgotten hives, their wax shaping the destiny of human journeys. So, when rain falls against your window and you see someone walking, shoulders wrapped in a glistening mantle, know this: you are glimpsing not just fabric, but history. You are seeing the ghost of the Middle Ages, a cloak born of storm and wax, still striding forward through time, unbowed, defiant, and timeless.